And we're live. Woo!
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another exciting, thrilling episode of React 30, the podcast all about React and JavaScript, where we promise not to waste more than 30 minutes of your time. I am your co-host, Michael Jackson. Joining me today is our co-hosts Kent C. Dodds
Hello.
and Ryan P. Florence.
Hello from Salt Lake City.
And our special guest.
Sorry, we gotta hang out, Ryan. That like threw things off.
Oh, you guys didn't even realize you were in the same city right now.
Nope.
Well, Ryan is kind of a maverick. You never know where he's going to be.
Not lately, anyway.
And joining us today is our special guest. He's works at Airbnb. He is not working from home, although he looks like he's working from home. He's actually working from the Airbnb offices. Leland Richardson. Say hi, Leland.
Hello.
Just wanted to say thank you so much for joining us today. Leland is the creator of Enzyme, which is this kind of cool jQuery-esque testing library. It's kind of a helper library for React applications. It knows how to traverse your React DOM or your React component hierarchy, kind of like jQuery knows how to traverse the DOM. So let's get right down to it. So Leland, when you were making Enzyme, what was the inspiration?
Yeah, it was like the first thing I made when I was at Airbnb. The second I got on a team, I started working on a project, refactoring a page into React, and one of the explicit goals of the project was to ensure that the new code had really good test coverage. And so the second I sort of started trying to do that, I got miserably frustrated for a lot of different reasons, a lot of which had some to do with the structure of code in our code base, but also just actually asserting on things React related was very difficult. So I kind of just had this idea to make things a little bit simpler to grab elements in the hierarchy and not not couple your tests to like the structure of your components and things like that. And the first version was much useful than the one now. The big change which came in our internal version 2.0, which does not correspond to 2.0 of Enzyme, but the internal version is when I turned it into a fluent interface similar to jQuery, which made it a lot more useful to chain operations and things like that.
So the specific use case that you were trying to solve was you were refactoring a page, you were writing some tests, and then you were trying to make assertions about sort of the structure of your page, or the stuff that you were rendering, and you were like, man, this is difficult. I can make this a lot easier if I had a helper, if I had a tool to help me with this.
Yeah, I
so
noticed.
Is that kind of the limit of the scope of Enzyme? Because on the tin it says testing utilities or something for React. So is that kind of the scope of it?
Yeah, I mean, right now it's considered something to help you test your React components, and it's fairly well coupled to React itself. There are kind of three different modes that we sort of export, which is shallow, render, and mount, which mount is kind of like full DOM rendering. It's like akin to running React.render into document with the React test utils, and shallow is using the shallow render which is what we recommend, and then render is kind of rendering things to HTML and then parsing the HTML and allowing you to assert on that. So that one's fairly separate from React, but the rest are pretty coupled.
So you've got a couple of different modes here. Shallow rendering, is that the same kind of shallow rendering that we could expect from like React's test utils? That's the same kind of thing. It's not actually, you don't ever actually get appended to a real DOM node in a real browser. Is that terminology is the same?
Right.
And then
yeah, and
fully
you're only ever
mounted
calling.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say with shallow, you're only ever rendering a single component. So you're calling one render method, and so you're just taking a slice of the full render tree in that case. But
could you talk about some of the trade-offs with that approach? Like, why would I use a shallow rendering versus full DOM or just the render?
Right. So the main thing is that when you want to test components, you kind of want to make sure that you're testing things in an isolated way, and so it's kind of tricky at first to know what the right thing to assert on is. If you're testing some sort of leaf node component that is kind of rendering out like pure native DOM components, then that's one thing. But once you build up a very large kind of component hierarchy, and you're testing some like kind of high-level abstraction component, you want to make sure that what it's actually rendering underneath is kind of not really exposed in this test. And so shallow rendering allows you to kind of isolate what you're asserting on to kind of what that component actually does and not what its child components do.
So actually, this is kind of interesting. Before the show, and actually ever since shallow rendering was kind of a thing in testing, I tried it out and I was like, this just feels like such an implementation detail thing. And I think you can get like tied up into that, especially if you have lots of like private components within like that you have scoped to the component that you're testing. I think that you can start getting into testing implementation details. But in like even our just really short conversation, I've been thinking that it actually does make sense, and I have an app that I'm working on the side right now where as you go up higher on the component tree, you start using a lot of different components, and like the higher you go, the less useful it is to actually, or the less possible it is to actually unit test that component. What you're actually doing, if you do like a full DOM render, is you're doing an integration test.
Right.
And so it seems to me like shallow rendering is the way that you could accomplish an actual unit test in these higher like these things that are higher up the component tree.
Yeah, I think the idea is that those child components, they should have their own unit tests. So there's no point in rendering those when you're testing a parent component that renders one of the children, right?
Yeah. So actually, maybe you can answer this for me then. So I'll have my component split up into multiple like private components, and so just like when you have a React components, it's just a function, and so just like in regular JavaScript, if you have a long function, you want to break up pieces of those into other functions. But with the shallow rendering, if you do that, then those pieces that you've broken out are now not rendered, even though they're really like an integral part of this component that you're exporting. So is there a way to get around that with shallow rendering? Can I say I want to render like these components, or like how would you handle that kind of a scenario?
Oh, still render these children, but not those ones? Is that kind of what
Yeah,
you're saying?
it's like
here's
you
a wide
have-
list of,
Yeah, that's like child favoritism right there.
yeah.
Yeah, this is a very real problem, especially with stateless functional components, which according to our style guide, we allow in the same file as another component, and so we started using
Which
these
is good.
fairly heavily. Right, Yeah, I mean, like you said, it's just a nice clean way to stay dry. And so, we're all very much in favor of that, but it does kind of produce a dilemma where it makes testing that component a little bit more difficult. And so one idea that I have that I haven't implemented yet, but there's a new JSON renderer that React Core has put out, kind of experimental, but what I'd like to do is build a renderer into Enzyme that actually kind of allows what you guys were suggesting, which is to have several different options that you can pass in to configure what depth you want to render to, and kind of selective depth depending on what actual component it is you're rendering. And so you could give it 4 components or something and say, I want you to continue rendering these when you run upon them, but every other component kind of stop there in the tree and treat it like a leaf node component. And I think that would work really, really well, but I just haven't gotten around to doing it yet.
Yeah, that'd be pretty cool.
I kind of like that idea. I could envision exporting like a test object or something that's like you only use this for tests, and that would have all the private components that you could say, okay, I want you to render these child components that are in this test object or something like that.
That gets really tricky though, because now you're refactoring a component and you're like, okay, here's a list, here's a UL in the middle of this thing, and I'm going to pull that out into its own little component, and now your test breaks.
Yeah.
And those are the tests that drive me nuts. Like, they're breaking, even though I'm not actually changing what my app does. And this is one of the reasons I've always avoided all of the test utilities, even React's. The only one I use is Simulate. Everything else I just render into a real node or to a string. Because I hate it when my test breaks just because I'm refactoring some stuff. It's like, well, why is that breaking?
That's what I generally would do too. I'd always have a handful of utility methods at the bottom of every one of my my test files, but I thought that was better than giving up the exactly what you're describing. One other thing, Leland, that you mentioned that I think it would be important to touch on, and it's not exactly related, but it's tangential, but it's something that I've been thinking about recently, is you mentioned it's good to have these private components because it's a good way to stay dry, and I agree. But in addition, it's a lot more than just dryness. It's these stateless components are good to help with readability as well. And so because there's a lot of I don't know, FUD that goes around with people trying to stay dry with their components, and people say, oh, the wrong no abstraction is better than the wrong abstraction, and don't try to do dry too early and stuff. You're gonna wind up with a real problem. And so they use that to say don't use stateless functional components everywhere, but it's really just about code organization and maintainability and readability. So anyway, that was totally tangential, but I thought it was important to say stateless functional components are awesome, and we should be using them for readability.
I like stateless ones better, or stateful ones better. Leland, I got a question for you. How do you handle testing focus with Enzyme? Is that in scope or is that out of scope?
Yeah, right now focus is very much kind of like a DOM paradigm, and so when you're testing things shallowly, at least, there's kind of no concept of it. The focus also is very dependent on global state inside of a browser. One thing can be focused at a time, and so it's also something that's difficult to kind of test with certainty if you're not testing kind of your entire app. With that said, you can still render a component into a real document with Enzyme and still use kind of the the nice helpful traversal things and stuff and run your tests. You're just doing full DOM rendering at that point.
Cool. And then I gotcha. And so then you can use the nice selectors and stuff to be like, hey, go find the button, or not the button, go find the list. Is this thing focused now after we click that button? That kind of stuff.
Right. Yeah, and
Cool.
it's easier to kind of simulate things. There's some helpers with Enzyme. It's actually one area that I think really needs to improve is the simulation of kind of realistic events. Like one big problem is if you want to test like a drag and drop library, it's incredibly difficult because there's so many events that you would need to end up simulating in that case.
Yeah.
In order
It's really
to
weird
really know
data.
what's going on.
And the events are really weird looking objects as well, with all the data transfer and all that stuff.
Yeah, if you're dragging
Right.
files and stuff.
So does Enzyme have a different simulate than, I guess I don't know. Does Enzyme use its own simulate, or are you using the React add-ons one?
Yeah, well, so the React add-ons one is actually only built for like fully rendered components, but we have kind of our own simulate that's built on top of Shallow. And there's been some recent development in this that I think is really great. We've added kind of experimental support for all lifecycle events that you can opt into if you want, like component did mount, component did update, and things like that. And then it also ensures that like state is batched and rendered properly, which is kind of handled different depending on which lifecycle event you're in. And so then the actual simulation of events with Shallow now, it tries to do the right thing and kind of bubbles properly and things like that, which didn't used to happen. When I first wrote it, it was kind of a simulate was sort of just an alias for function.prototype.call, so wasn't actually doing that much.
Interesting. I have a faint memory of someone on the React core team saying something about like they want to ditch all their test utilities and maybe just use Enzyme. Am I just making that up, or is there some conversation going on there?
Yeah, no, you're not making that up. We've been talking about it for a little while. I think bottom line, the React core team is interested in other people, other companies, kind of getting involved, but more importantly, involved don't actually themselves care all that much about. And I think React test utils is something that hasn't seen a ton of attention, over the past couple of years, and so the community is kind of starting to use Enzyme pretty heavily, and I think the React core team is interested in kind of letting that burden fall off of their plate.
So I was reading around. We were talking a little bit about kind of this custom simulate that you guys have written on top of your Shallow renderer. And I noticed one of the caveats is that event propagation is not supported yet. I can imagine that would actually be kind of tricky to implement. Whenever I find myself re-implementing stuff that browsers actually do, which I've actually been doing quite a bit in the last week or so with my history library, taking another hard look at that. You realize that there's actually kind of a lot more going on there than you originally thought. So could you talk a little bit about kind of what it might take to actually support propagation, event dot stop propagation, things like that in Enzyme, and what are the blockers there? Is it because of the implementation that you guys currently have, or is it just because it's a hard problem and you just haven't had time to address it?
So there are some people trying to work on this. I think there's a PR out there right now, and the main hesitation, as you point out, is you're implementing some things that can get quite hairy, and so we want to make sure that if we do ever start supporting it, that the functionality that we're supporting is kind of the correct functionality instead of some slightly wrong functionality that later makes it harder for us to make it more correct because people are depending on the nuance of the incorrect implementation.
Absolutely.
So this is something that like we're interested in supporting, but being careful. It's also something that everyone has to realize is that we don't have all of the information, right? So when we're light just went off. So you can see me. So if we're testing something in the context of enzyme shallow rendering, we really don't know, and intentionally don't know what the rest of the document looks like, and that includes every component, up the hierarchy that would have a chance to stop propagation and things like this. And so, asserting on this type of behavior.
The shallow rendering, right? That's kind of the point of shallow rendering. Is I'm just going to isolate my test to just these, just the render output of this one component, right?
Right.
Yeah. So propagation in that context is probably not a terribly useful feature. You probably would want to say, hey, if you need propagation, right? If I have a component somewhere in the hierarchy that calls event.stop propagation or whatever, and I need to sort of test that behavior, I could just, for that one test, maybe I could opt into the full mount, I guess version or method of using Enzyme. Is that possible to just sort of say, okay, I want to do shallow rendering for these 99 tests, and for this test over here, I want to do the full mounted version?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we mix and match depending on the needs for lots of things. But even in that case, the problem with propagation is that the things that can affect your component are actually up in the tree rather than down the tree. And so when you have some component and you want to fully render it, you can't, unless you know all of the places that are mounting that component in your application, you can't really know for certain that you're not doing something wrong.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Okay, cool. So just looking at more kind of the, I see you've got a section on the Enzyme Repo where you're talking about future work. You say currently we don't support hierarchical CSS selectors. So again, that's probably not something that's, I mean, all of these things are probably not terribly useful in that 99% of the time you're doing the shallow rendering, but sometime it might be useful, right? If you've got really complex CSS selectors. I guess you've got a lot of people in React these days who aren't even using CSS selectors, right? So you probably got this whole section of user base they're like, I don't care about that. What about you guys at Airbnb? What are you guys doing? Are you guys following the inline CSS crowd or?
Yeah, it's a tricky question. Actually, so our main repo right now, we try to head towards BEM style CSS. Although I'm not personally a fan of kind of how the developer experience, but I think the idea is correct in that you're writing componentized CSS effectively. But I'm personally a fan of the CSS and JS kind of movement going on. We are experimenting with some other libraries in a component library that we're building internally. We're using Aphrodite, which is built by Khan Academy, and it is kind of a CSS and JS variant that so far has been working out reasonably well.
I think it's all that Kent talks about lately.
Yeah, I freaking love Aphrodite. It's awesome. So actually, I
Well,
just as kind of FYI, we've got just about 5 minutes, and I have a kind of technical question. You know, we like to dive deep here at React 30. So you have these three main uses of enzyme: shallow rendering, full DOM rendering with mount, and static render markup with render. So I'm curious about like some of the implementation of each of these. So shallow, like what the result is just virtual DOM, an object, and you can validate my assumptions here. And full DOM rendering, like what you're traversing is actual DOM, and then in static, what you're traversing is like HTML string. Is that correct?
Yeah. So for shallow, we internally use the shallow renderer, although we may end up moving to our a kind of a forked implementation of it. But that would require us to access more React internals. And in that case, we're just sort of traversing, you know, an object. In the case of rendered in a DOM, we're traversing the same way. We're traversing the same way that like actual React does. So we hitch on the backing instance and kind of walk down the tree that way. So we're not actually traversing DOM nodes or anything, even though they do exist in memory. And then render.
Sorry, Leland. Help me understand that a little more fully. Does that mean so if you're walking down the DOM node tree, does that mean you guys need find DOM node to like, in order for that to work?
No, so
the only reason I ask is because I saw some conversation recently. I think Dan Abramov tweeted the other day. He's like, "Are people using find DOM node, or can we get rid of it?" And I was like, "Huh. I guess maybe you could get rid of it using like the ref callback thing." Anyway, it was just when you said that, I kind of thought, I wonder if there's a real valid use case that Enzyme has for find DOM node there.
Yeah, there's actually not. We have an API that allows you to get the actual DOM node of like an enzyme node, which uses find DOM node, but the actual traversal and all of that just uses the internal instance from React and kind of walks down in-memory objects, not anything held by the DOM.
Okay, cool. Smart. That sounds smart. Sorry, I got you off track. What was your question, Kent? What were you guys?
Yeah. So we talked about on shallow rendering, you're traversing an object, and you're using React to do that. On full DOM rendering, you're still actually traversing the components, not the DOM as much. And then static, what are you traversing to? Like when I say wrapper.find on a statically rendered thing, you're just like what are you using to traverse the HTML?
Cheerio.
Yeah. So so with render, we're actually kind of cheating because the parsing HTML is kind of a pretty tricky business, and someone else has already done it much better than I felt we could. So realistically, all I'm doing is wrapping the statically rendered output of the component tree into Cheerio and then returning the Cheerio wrapper. Cheerio is kind of a jQuery jQuery-esque like HTML parser that works in Node and any environment.
Man, I might have just entered HTML something.
Can't you just parse HTML with like a regular expression or something? Like, couldn't you just like figure out a really
it's
clever...
Oh man.
You guys know the Stack Overflow post about that, right?
Yeah.
You'll have to link us to that later.
Yeah. That's one of the milestones. Oh, we're almost out. Hey,
we got 10 seconds.
How'd you come up with the name Enzyme?
Gosh, the name was kind of a big mess. It's like the fourth name that this libraries had. I don't know if you guys remember this. When we first released it, we picked a reagent, which is the name of a popular ClojureScript library, and we didn't really do our due diligence there. So we ended up renaming it to Enzyme, which is kind of another sort of chemistry-themed, name, and we just liked it. It wasn't that interesting of a choice.
Well, cool.
I think it's an awesome name. I love it.
Yeah, thanks.
What do enzymes do?
Well, hey, Leland, we just want to say thank you so much for coming on the show today. I mean, it's obvious that you've done a ton of great work here and done a lot of deep thinking about, testing in React, how to improve it. You're doing a great service to the community, to your company, to all of us. So thank you so much, and thanks for being on the show. And yeah.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
See you next time.